Okay, the last two ages and eras of religious life, and again, hopefully done in with a focus, with a lens of the French context and the American context, to kind of particularize this a little bit for Holy Cross, although I'm really not going to go into any great detail about our own history as a congregation. I think that some of that history is known to you. I'll mention some things in passing to kind of place it in this broader story. But ultimately, in a certain sense, I have a different end, a different goal in mind than merely doing the history of Holy Cross. This next age, these next ages of religious life, the apostolic orders and the teaching congregations, really begin with St. Ignatius of Loyola. Born in 1491 in the Basque region of Spain, as a young man he enters military service. He helps defend Pamplona against French invasion, but his legs are badly wounded by a cannonball, and he spends a number of months in recovery, during which his only consolation is the thought that his life will now be given over to emulating the mendicant fathers, to emulating Francis and Dominic, and living that life of a poor friar, poor brother, teaching and preaching in the streets. He retreats after he's fully healed to Manresa for a year of fasting and prayer, and it's in that moment that the famed spiritual exercises emerge, right? As his lessons and his recommendations to others about how to enter into the spiritual life and the life of prayer. He goes on pilgrimage to Jerusalem, where he actually intends to spend the rest of his life as a mendicant, as a street preacher, as a poor friar. Through a series of instances, it ends up he does not stay in Jerusalem. He comes back to Europe. He ends up in university in Barcelona, finally getting a long-delayed education. But as a student, he continues to wear his pilgrim robe, right? So he is, in fact, emulating still these mendicant communities, right, of wearing a very simple robe. He begged for his meals. He preached on the streets. He was looking like Francis and Dominic. He's joined pretty quickly by several others, names that you might know: Francis Xavier, Pierre Favre. Those are his first permanent recruits. A fellow Spaniard, Diego Manez, who ends up replacing Ignatius as the superior general of the community, also joins at this time. Together they begin referring to themselves as the Company of Jesus. Right? We know it as the Society, the Company of Jesus. They're thought to be enlightened ones, which was a phrase that was used, to be perfectly honest, for kind of fringe elements, right? Fringe street preachers. Maybe like we would think about the guy who stands in Times Square and starts, screaming about the end of the world. A little bit crazy. Ignatius, are you one of those? Are you one of those enlightened ones? He ends up spending time in prison under the Inquisition. The Inquisition in Spain at this time, right, run in large part by the Dominican friars, kind of looking out for heretics, looking out for questionable teachings, looking out for crazies. Ignatius is suspected as being one. Actually spent some time in the prison of the Inquisition. He's released. He continues. August 15th, 1534, he and his followers take their first vows. In June of 1537, he and 6 of the followers are ordained priests. By 1540, this Company of Jesus has received approval of their rule by the Holy Father. They are a recognized religious community. And by that same period of time, basically the same time that they've received their approbations as a community, they already have members abroad. Francis Xavier is already in India and in Asia. Favre is already in Germany, has left Spain and France. So from the very beginning, the Jesuits are a missionary community. I want to mention 3 aspects of their structure and their organization that is unique or different or somehow contributes to this change of era in religious life. The first is that there were no chapters like in a monastery. There were no elections like the Cistercians had, right? This was going back to a very powerful superior general, a very powerful local superior. This was so that the men of the community could be out there doing the work, and not spending their time just sitting around and having elections and having deliberations and having conversations about how they should do things. It's just like, get out there, do it. Get out there, they're doing it, the work is needed, kind of diminishing some of that internal cohesion and putting it all in one person's role, right? And if he does that job really, really well, then the rest of us are free to go do the work that needs to be done. I think that is what contributes to the sense that we have even today that the Jesuits are maybe a little bit more of a military-like structure. Maybe that comes from Ignatius's own experience as a soldier in the military, right? That there is the appointment of superiors from on high, right? And not so much a chapter and an election system. But again, the aim is not really to eliminate democracy. The aim is to get people out as quickly and as effectively as possible for work. The second interesting development is that Ignatius organizes his rule, his constitutions, chronologically, which is to say that he lays out his rule from the moment that a neophyte enters the front door and says, I want to be a Jesuit, to the moment that they're out in the field working. And the whole structure of the way he sees the community, the company of Jesus, is the preparation and the movement towards mission, the chronological length of formation. Finally, again, because the movement was so aimed towards work and towards mission, and because this personal formation, this chronology of preparation for work was so effective and so particular, the thought is that some of the typical supports for religious life that existed in a monastic community, the ordered rule, the ordered schedule, the communal prayer, some of those things are actually minimized and diminished to the point where there is not as much of an expectation that Jesuits are going to pray together. There's an expectation they're going to pray, that they're going to say the office, that they're going to pray privately. But there's less and less of an expectation that you're going to pray every hour of the Liturgy of the Hours together. Because if you're doing that, that's all the time you've got for it. And you don't have enough time to be doing the work, right? So there is this shift that's happening at this time. The Jesuits are this perfect kind of encapsulation of it. So the new focus of religious life is missionary activity. Teaching and preaching, foreign missions, et cetera, et cetera. One of the other aspects that the Jesuits heighten in religious life at this time is association with the papacy. That's primarily because Ignatius says, we're going to take a vow that we are loyal to the Holy Father, that he has the broad view of what the church needs, and we are going to make ourselves available to him so that he can send us wherever that greatest need is. Because we can't know what that is, but he's got the big picture because he's the guy in charge. And so we're going to pledge our obedience and our loyalty to him, and we're going to put ourselves in his hands and allow him to use us as he sees fit for the service of the church. Right? And so from the very earliest time, the Jesuits are uniquely connected in people's minds and in reality to the papacy. That's very good for their advancement and their development and their spreading. It will later, and I'll mention it just briefly in a couple minutes, it also becomes a challenge for them and an obstacle. The Jesuits are first and foremost missionaries, as I've been harping on. Jesuit missionaries are the first people to find the source of the Blue Nile. They charted the Amazon and the Mississippi rivers, and we know the heroic stories of Francis Xavier and the deaths of Campion and Southwell, these Jesuits who are martyred for the faith because of their missionary activity. They almost become legendary. We also know that the Jesuits become known, because they're missionaries, for a certain amount of flexibility. Jared will talk a little bit about religious dress and the way that that looks and changes at different times. The Jesuits never really had a unique way of dressing and looking because everything was aimed towards mission, everything was aimed towards the way things were in the locale that they were working. And so they dressed just simply the way that a local diocesan priest would dress was what Ignatius expected. But we know about Francis Xavier and the way that he tries to adapt the church's teaching in a way that's understandable to the culture that he's working in, etc., right? So flexibility and adaptability become these traits that are highly valued in the recruiting of Jesuits, right? I said each era has a different virtue. Obedience maybe under the monastic rule. Now the virtues maybe are flexibility and self-sufficiency. If you're a missionary, you're going to be out on your own. You're not going to be living in a monastic community. You're not going to have that daily support of 500 other guys living with you or whatever. You know, you're going to have to be a little bit of a self-starter. You're going to have to be strong. You're going to have to be flexible. At the same time, before too long, the Jesuits begin to recognize the advantage of having schools and being connected to schools. They recognize the need of education, and they recognize the advantage of having institutions for themselves as an order, so that they're not merely out in 2s and 3s in mission territories, but that they do have some communal place to hang their hat and to call home. This is when they really become, I've referred to them as an apostolic order. This is where they also begin to give us an inclination of the founding of teaching orders and the important role that schools and the running of schools will have for religious communities over these next 2 eras. In fact, by the time of the suppression of the Jesuits, which I'll mention in just a second, the suppression occurred in 1773. By 1773, they ran 800 universities and colleges around the world. That's pretty amazing, given that short amount of time. And as I say, we'll talk in a minute about how they open up a new era for religious life and the life of the church by making education such a central part of their life. Thus far, I've been talking about the Jesuits as responding to the needs of the church and responding to the time by really kind of trying to reinvigorate mendicant life. Ignatius wants to be like Francis and Benedict. I have not yet spoken about the Jesuits as a response to the needs of the church because of the Protestant Reformation. And that's because actually, even though these events are contemporaneous, Ignatius did not at first see his founding as the Jesuits as a direct response to the Reformation. That understanding, that self-understanding that the Jesuits ended up developing only came later. It does in fact come. The Jesuits do in fact see themselves as having to address the most drastic need of the church at the time, which is the schism, is the splitting apart of the church, right? The Jesuits do step forward in that regard. Like most Christians at the time, both Catholics especially at the time, the Reformation would have principally been seen not as a political reality or an economic reality, it would have been seen as a spiritual reality. The church has split because sin is in the world, right? From the Catholic point of view, that's Luther and the heretics, right? From the Protestant points of view, we're leaving because you guys are getting this wrong, right? From either side, right? Both sides would have thought sin is the real reality that's here. And so the response that the Jesuits make to the Protestant Reformation is a spiritual response. It is the marshaling of spiritual tools, in fact, that the Protestant Reformation was rejecting. It's a marshaling of the Rosary. It's a marshaling of exposition of the Blessed Sacrament and devotion to the Eucharistic liturgy and parish missions, right? This is what the Jesuits kind of put forward as what's referred to as a Tridentine Catholicism, coming from the Council of Trent, kind of a shoring up of the church and the church's tradition in the face of the challenge of the Protestant Reformation. The Jesuits also, at this time, because of their loyalty to the Pope and because of the challenge of the politics of the Reformation, attempt to shore up the church's political power, to respond to the challenges of Protestantism, to preach in foreign missions, to come to grips with the scientific revolution, with modern philosophy, with the rise of the nation state, which starts to occur at this time. These are all realities that the Jesuit life is trying to address. In doing so, and in being so connected with the papacy, the Jesuits therefore become a lightning rod for all of those who would like to see the power of the papacy, the power of the church, etc., diminished, right? And so whenever the Pope is being attacked, the Jesuits are being attacked. And that's ultimately how we should understand the suppression of the Jesuits in 1773. We who are not Jesuits like to tease them, right? We like to make fun of the Jesuits so much. And pointing to the suppression of the Jesuits is a really easy thing to do, to make fun of them and to say, geez, you're a bunch of screw-ups, you know, look at you, you got suppressed. In reality, it really was the anti-papal politics that lead to the Jesuits to being suppressed. Thankfully, they're able to survive in part because St. Catherine the Great in Russia allows the Jesuits to remain as an order, right? It's one of the ways that the tradition perseveres through the suppression, but I'm not going to go into that in any great detail. I have been talking mainly in a kind of gender-neutral way about religious life I guess I focused mainly on male founders and male leaders, but the way that I was speaking about hermit's life and monastic life was as true for women as it was true for men. This is maybe an era where that starts to be less true. And I'm going to continue to focus more, I guess, on the male evolution of religious life, since we're moving to a more particular focus in Holy Cross. But real briefly, just a mention of that fact, of this divergence that occurs, primarily because it continues to be thought that the primary way for women to live religious life is the monastic cloister. Right? And reformations of women's religious life that want to see women running schools and running hospitals, they exist. The Ursulines are a great example. St. Angela Merici, I think I probably have, there's Francis Xavier on mission in India. There's the symbol of the society. Some of the great examples of the Jesuit missionaries. We skipped over that. Some of the, I guess I didn't have Angela Merici, sorry. Oh, there she is. The Ursuline sisters and some of the reforms of St. Francis de Sales and the Dissensions, etc., St. Vincent de Paul, rather. Any attempt to have women to do teaching and do hospital work and whatever else have to deal with the fact that the church's expectation is that women's religious life is going to be cloistered. And so all of the changes that will occur to women's religious life over the next centuries are going to find various ways to deal with that. Sometimes it's by putting a school next to the cloister. And so they never actually have to really leave the cloister to do teaching. And so we got around it that way. Or some of the founders like Angela Merici and Francis de Sales say the other way to get around it is don't take final vows. You'll just take temporary vows. You'll just renew them constantly, and you'll promise to renew them hopefully for the rest of your life, and you're going to stay in the community. But because you haven't taken the final vows, you're not wed to the cloister in the same way. And so you're going to have a little bit more freedom. And so there are ways that founders and foundresses kind of look to get around this. And it ultimately points towards a further evolution of women's religious life and of men's religious life, which is a kind of really busting open of the cloister for a large majority of religious and out into mission work. And again, at least in passing, I'll speak about that in the future. I want to give a little bit more of the French context, as I had promised, because at this time, here's Francis de Sales, there's Vincent de Paul, we're skipping that. I want to talk about the French context because at this time, the church in France, and France itself as an empire, reaches the zenith of its power in the church and in the culture of Europe. French Jesuits, French Ursuline sisters are really setting the tone and the pace of missionary life in the church in a way that Spain had maybe in the 100 years before that, especially with the Jesuits. I want to talk briefly about the church in France prior to the crisis moment of the Revolution. Prior to the Revolution, there were 60,000 parish clergy in France, 26,000 monks, 55,000 nuns. The great monastic orders of France still owned between 6 and 10% of the entire surface area of France. Right? So amazing power. There were, however, also indications that religious life and religious observance in France at this time was already beginning to decay and decline. The number of people asking for Mass to be said for their soul in their will after they died was declining. The number of marriages was declining. There were other statistical indications that religious observance was diminishing. But, and then I should also mention, there was also malaise in religious life. There's actually a petition that goes around at this time amongst the monks of France asking for the rules of monastic life to be softened. It's just a bit too hard. Could we make the rules a little bit easier? There's these signs growing that kind of, maybe things aren't as strong and as we had imagined. We have the rise of Freemasonry, we have the Enlightenment values, kind of secular in orientation. Then the revolution starts to percolate. In November of 1789, the National Assembly of France places the church's property at the disposal of the nation, which is to say that it took all over the church's property. Again, that means that nearly 10% of the surface area of France changes hands immediately. On February 13th, 1790, The taking of religious vows is forbidden. July 12th, 1790, the civic constitution of the clergy is passed. Dioceses are abolished. Bishops are required to serve no longer as bishops, but now as parish priests. In November of 1790, the Assembly demands that religious and priests take an oath of loyalty to the state. And then before long, in August of 1792, they announced that those who have not taken the oath of loyalty are going to be deported from France. I said the real fun began, now it really kicks off. January 21st, 1793, the king is executed, the revolution has truly begun. The Jacobins take over eventually, right? Church bells are melted down into make cannons, confessional boxes are destroyed. 260 priests are murdered. Sacred vessels are destroyed. There gets to be a point in 1794 where maybe only about 100 parishes in the entirety of France celebrate Mass on Sunday morning. Here's a kind of indication of the decline of the numbers of the great monastic communities in France during that period, 1170 to 1790. It's a kind of continual decline. Napoleon makes things a little bit better when he signs the Concordat with the church, but it's not great. The beginning of the 19th century was not a time when you would have thought that religious life was going to grow. You weren't even going to think it was going to survive. This is certainly a turning point moment, certainly a crisis moment in that negative sense of the word. I dwell on it because in a moment or two it's going to be the context in which Holy Cross is founded, but also because of what I want to say by the end of my next 20 minutes, and that is that there have been plenty of times throughout the history of the church that because of problems within religious life, or because of societal changes outside of religious life, or both, it would have been easy to say, this isn't going to last. Here are some of the bad things of the revolution. And then that happens. Between 1808 and 1878, the number of religious women in France does that. So obviously religious life survived. Something that you could never have predicted, a new vitality, a growth beyond even what had existed prior, comes to be. Typical of this era is the 400 new religious orders that are founded at this time. Even though some of the anti-clerical persecutions remain, the monasteries, the women's religious communities, even the diocesan clergy, all rebound. To the point where the Bishop of Le Mans, France, where Holy Cross is founded, as you have probably all heard, ends up saying at a certain point, about this time, if you're in my diocesan seminary, you might want to think about where else you might want to work, because I don't have enough jobs for all of you guys who are in the seminary. Isn't that a nice problem to have, right? You never would have guessed that when priests and nuns are being put under the guillotine, when the monastic houses are being torn down and all of its money and all of its property is taken away, etc., 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 etc. And yet it happens. Typical of these new orders is the focus on education. We have John Baptiste de La Salle's Christian Brothers at this time. We have the Brothers of Christian Doctrine founded at this time. Here you see the growth of brothers. We had sisters just a second ago. Here's brothers. And you can see in particular teaching brothers always being a significant portion of that group. In part because it maybe speaks to both the need of the age. The church has been decimated. The country's been in revolution and civil war. Who's running the schools? Who's teaching the kids, right? And then also it speaks to the ethos of the era, because part of the ideal of the revolution was the Enlightenment, and part of the idea of the revolution was that everybody deserves an education, not just the wealthy. And so the church kind of speaks to both of those realities by increasing the amount of teaching it does and is doing in the running of schools, right? It's going to teach anybody regardless of wealth and privilege, and it's going to help rebuild society as a whole, and the church in particular, by taking care of the next generation. Again, the Third Republic still included some anti-clericalism. The Third Republic was still rooted in the idea of nationalism. The state was the most important reality in your life. It still had all these ideas that contradicted the principal ideas of religious life. That faith is the most important part of your life, not the state. That living in community and seeing yourself as part of a community is important. Whereas the revolution says, liberté, right? More individualistic approach, an enlightenment approach. Religious life kind of contradicts all of these things. And yet, the numbers continue to grow, right? And yet it still is offering something that is so attractive. Men and women of this era are living it so authentically that it draws young people to enter into it. That's the context, again, in which Holy Cross's story would be told. It's the story of all the way up until the 1950s and 60s, right? The story of these teaching communities, these missionary communities, who from France and through Spain and through the missionary efforts spread to all the world. They moved with immigrants as they moved to other parts of the world, Australia, to the United States in particular, to Canada. This is the story of Holy Cross, founded in the wake of the Revolution, seeking to rebuild the church after the devastation of the Revolution, working in education, working amongst the poor and the middle class and everywhere in between, because everyone deserves an education. And it also kind of looks a little bit ahead towards the idea that Father Moreau very quickly sent members of his community on foreign mission, where they end up in the United States. And where I'd like to now shift, as I just gave you a little bit of a context of France, and how things changed so drastically there, and why Holy Cross was founded, to now look at the United States and how religious life changed in this final era, the era that I say that we're still living in, this era of the Vatican Council and reform. I specifically work on the history of the church in the United States, and it's typically said the best way to tell that story is that it's an immigrant story, right? The Italians, the Irish, the Germans, the Poles, the Lithuanians, all these Catholic groups who come from Europe to the United States and make the United States, which was never a Catholic country, always not predominantly Protestant, actually makes it so that the largest single religious group in the United States is Catholicism, right? And that basically happens because of immigration. That story is true, but it's not the whole story. Because in reality, historians would say that most of the 24 million Catholics in the United States at that time would have been more likely to be categorized as potential Catholics than as active and practicing Catholics. Is that in reality, the United States created the context in which these immigrants became more involved in their faith, not less. Became more devoted to their parish, not less. Perhaps that's because the bishops were afraid that in coming to this Protestant country, these immigrants might lose their faith, and so maybe the bishops worked really hard to create institutions that would keep them. Perhaps it was because these people came to a culture that was anti-Catholic, Irish need not apply, etc., 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 and they clung to what they had, a community, and part of that identity was an ethnic and a religious identity. There's all sorts of reasons for that. But it's factually true that the church in the United States is remarkably successful at not only maintaining the connection it has with those immigrant communities, even as they cross the Atlantic, but increasing that connectivity, and doing it through ethnic parishes, right, that create a context for the maintenance of language and the passing on of culture, through parish missions, and through the religious orders that preach the parish missions. Holy Cross included, but perhaps most especially the Redemptorist Fathers and the Paulist Fathers, who made a legacy of that. And then finally, perhaps most importantly, through schools and orphanages and hospitals, through the founding of a whole separate system, right, of social care for Catholics that was overwhelmingly built by religious women, right? And so the role that religious life played in the establishment and the success and the vitality of Catholicism in the United States. I think I have, here's Moreau, we kind of blew past him. Remember, as Father Jim said, this is something that some of the men in the room as novices heard in Colorado Springs, thanks to Father Kevin, and they hear it over like 6 or 7 hours over the course of 2.5 days. So this really has been condensed for you. There's that growth of Catholicism, just exponential during that period of immigration. But again, it's crucially important that they were maintained in their adherence to the church and increased their involvement in the church. Ethnic Catholicism being crucial to that. Just real briefly, it's precisely at the time that American Protestantism thinks that Catholicism is most monolithic, that American Catholicism is most diverse. At the very moment that Protestants in America are feeling, oh, they're all the same, and they all are loyal to the Pope, and they're coming over here as an army to take over the United States, it's precisely at that moment that American Catholicism is at its most diverse. The most number of languages and ethnicities and cultures represented in the melting pot. Here's just a quick example of the rapid institutionalization, the formation of structures to support that Catholic life and to keep those immigrants as part of the church's life. And as I say, it was the nuns especially, but priests and brothers of religious orders as well, who helped do this. The number of orphanages with the number of children, the number of seminarians and seminaries, colleges with students, academies for girls, parochial schools with parochial school students, right? A whole empire of religious services created quickly, right? The height of immigration in the 1880s, this is in 1916, right? So pretty impressive development and growth. It's also a very Irish community. That's just to look at the bishops of the Archdiocese of New York. If you look at the names, there's one Frenchman. Other than that, they're all Irish. And that's still true to this day. That's kind of important because, although I don't have the time to go into it, we could talk about the history of the church in Ireland under oppression of British Protestantism and the particular form of Catholicism that develops in Ireland and the way that that is transferred to the United States and the way that that helps keep immigrants loyal to the church, because Irish Catholicism was used to being a minority, even in their own country. They were used to being persecuted, even in their own country. And so they bring a form of Catholicism that is perhaps used to being in tension with the broader society, used to being a little bit separated, used to have to do its own thing to preserve itself, right? Maybe that's part of the success story that I've just indicated that existed. Though let's not forget the Germans, and we are living right here, right now, in the midst of the German Triangle, the heart of the German Catholic immigration in the Midwest, not so much on the East Coast, though it exists. This high tension, as I've referred to it, American Catholicism, only really begins to fall apart after the Second World War. It's only as a result of Catholics and Jews and Protestants being in the same foxhole, right, in the Second World War, that Protestants and Jews and Catholics actually even get to start to meet one another. Because prior to that, life was pretty much in a Catholic ghetto or a Protestant ghetto or a Jewish ghetto, right? All of a sudden, to be either a Protestant or a Catholic or a Jew is to be equally American. That was the first time that that was really to be taught and thought in American life. Then there were opportunities like the GI Bill that Catholic soldiers took advantage of when they came back from the Second World War, the rise of educational attainment in the American Catholic community, the rise, therefore, then of financial achievement in the American Catholic community. Those are all upsides, right? And the upside is that you're integrated. You're no longer excluded. You're no longer Irish need not apply. But maybe the downside then is that when you're so committed to something that's exclusive or different or set aside or other, as you integrate, what might also get lost in that process. So these are some of the things that religious life has to respond to in the American context in the modern era. And it's precisely that era that then gives rise, of course, also to the Second Vatican Council and another instance of reform, renewal, change, and societal need that religious life needs to respond to. I could go on and on about what some of these other things are, right? Again, economic increases of attainment in American Catholicism, the move to the suburbs, the decline of the urban parish and the urban ethnic enclave, right? The Second Vatican Council, which we'll come back to in a little bit. Even the protests of the 1960s, the civil rights movement, the civil rights movement and the anti-Vietnam War movement were crucially important, especially among religious women in the United States, for kind of, again, busting open that cloister of saying, we don't want to merely just be running schools at the parish and dealing only with Catholic school kids. We want to recognize that there's also a need amongst African Americans, and there's an injustice that needs to be spoken to. So pictures of sisters in their habits marching, right, in Chicago in protest of racial segregation of housing, et cetera, et cetera. Crucially important in a change that occurs at this time in religious life, especially for women, as I say, to recognize the needs of the times and to respond to them. Let me come back to the Second Vatican Council. There were many positives associated with these changes. I've just indicated some of them. There were also those who warned that, again, this loss of distinctiveness, this loss of an internal cohesion might be a dangerous thing. Will Herberg, the sociologist who coined the phrase and wrote the book entitled Protestant Catholic Jew, indicating that any of the three groups could now be considered faithful Americans. He said, and he was a Jew, by the way, he says, I say that just the opposite, that in all that is important, the church must stand firm in its witness to the truth that's eternal and unchanging. If it is to remain true to its vocation, it must take a stand against the world, against the age, against the spirit of the age, because the world and the age are always, in a certain sense, at a contradiction, in rebellion against the will of God. That's not to poo-poo modernity. That's not to say 60s bad, 50s good. It's none of that. That's to say that in every age, the gospel critiques culture, because no culture is the fulfillment of the embodiment of the gospel, right? And so part of the response that religious life has always had to make, all the stories that I've been telling all along, from moving into the desert because the persecutions had ended, to moving into the cities, to teaching at the universities with the mendicant fathers, to the post-Vatican Council world. In each of those eras, and in every era, the religious life has to recognize that what it has is different. And it's going to be a little bit discordant on some level with the major tone that's being played, right, by the band, right? Again, it's the French Revolution and the religious life speaking against statism and against a secular view, materialist view of humanity, right? There's always going to be that tension, right? And perhaps that is one of the challenges of the current era, of recognizing what are those critiques that the gospel has to offer to society, and how can they be made effectively, with charity, with love, with truth, in such a way that calls society to a better embodiment of the gospel. Never going to be perfect, but always calling people to greater holiness and greater fidelity. Talk about crisis moments and turning points. Again, all the benefit that comes from the changes to religious life and the changes to the church in the wake of the Second Vatican Council and the era of the 1960s. It's also true that there were pitfalls. One of the pitfalls here is kind of a thumbnail sketch. From its height, around 1958, 1959, weekly Sunday Mass attendance, pretty steep drop-off, or pretty kind of continual decline since that height in the late 50s to this time, with, again, some occasional bumps up, but pretty significant drop-off in numbers. Again, the reason for that, there's all sorts of reasons. Again, the economic reasons, the cultural reasons, the theological reasons, including the Second Vatican Council and reactions to Humanae Vitae. Historians will point to this and say this is a crucially important issue, right? To explain why numbers do what they do. Here's that picture I mentioned earlier, sisters marching. But this is what happens then to religious life in the period from 1966 to 2003. And again, for all of the manifest good that has occurred, there are challenges too. And here is one of the greatest. It's probably nothing you've ever heard before. You haven't heard before, right? You know that the number of religious sisters is not what it once was. You know that the number of religious priests and brothers is not what it once was. And there's the statistical kind of proof of that. I think it's fair to say that even amidst this moment of reform and renewal, we are also in a moment of crisis. And you've heard it said, there's a moment of crisis in religious life, right? In a certain sense, I end here, but not because I think that what I have done in these 2 short 35 or 40-minute sessions is in any way meant to be negative. In fact, quite the opposite. I have intended, and I hope that I have achieved, a rather hopeful and positive evaluation of the history of religious life. Because I don't think that that looks any better or any worse than what the numbers I showed you about the French Revolution look like. And if I had the statistics, which I don't because they just don't exist, because statistical sociology just didn't exist when Benedict was building his monastery, but in the 12th century, I could bet you I could find that when Benedictine monasticism collapsed, the numbers look like this or worse, right? So at any different age in the history of religious life, there have been all these moments of crisis, all these moments of reform and renewal and change of religious life and fidelity with which it was lived, but also societal pressures on religious life, etc., etc., etc. We're in one of those moments now, but I don't think that we should say to ourselves, woe is me. We live in this unique age. It's never been this bad before. It's never been like this before. Where is it going to go? No, the church has been here dozens of times before, right? And yet here's religious life still. Here's the church still, even though people would have predicted that was over too, right? Precisely because of what I said from the beginning, is that there will always be religious life in the church, because there will always be all Christians striving to emulate Christ. And amongst those, there will be a smaller group that are called to emulate him in a very particular way, to live that life as consecrated religious, as priests, brothers, sisters, living vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, emulating him who was poor and chaste and obedient, being in mission of service and teaching and diaconal, broadly conceived, diaconal ministry to the people of God, washing feet, right? There will always be that reality in the church. It simply is a question for us today, how will we live it more authentically? As moments of crisis throughout the history of church have called people to live more authentically, to reform, to go back to ideals. It's only left for us to say, who's the Saint Benedict of this era? Who's the Francis, the Dominic, the Clare? Who's the Mother Teresa? Maybe she's one of those examples, maybe, right? Maybe one of those answers to prayer. Who are those people, right? How can we notice them and encourage their vocation and build them up? How can we support them? How can we encourage authenticity of witness and fidelity to ideals amongst the religious we know? Those are all things I think that you as beloved lay collaborators can help us do in this next age and this next era of religious life. Not so unlike an awful lot of ages and eras that have come before, I don't think. And I think in a certain sense, therefore, exciting and intriguing to pray and to ask, Lord, where will your Spirit raise up this next iteration, this next great saint, this next great reform? And then to ask in prayer, Lord, how can I be somehow a part of that? How can I somehow give my gifts to see it happen? Thanks for listening to me at great length, and thanks for putting up with broadly painted brush over 2,000 years of history. I have a minute or two more on my clock. I thought we could open it up, and if you had any questions or comments from my first 2 presentations, I'd love to hear them, I'd love to entertain them. And then we'll break, and Jared can get a little bit more theological, a little bit less historical. Please.
What was the relationship between the
In a certain sense, almost non-existent, because how we understand the papacy simply didn't yet exist. We understand the papacy very much as a modern governmental and political powerful leader, an international figure, a person who has, if not direct and immediate control over every aspect of church life, an awful lot to say about even how we would do things in our parish in South Bend, Indiana, right? That simply just did not exist at the height of monasticism, either the height of desert monasticism or the height of European Benedictine monasticism. That evolution of the papacy really doesn't come until the era of the Jesuits, to be perfectly honest, and the rise of a powerful national political leadership for the papacy. That said, it was still always true that the Pope presided as eldest brother, so to speak, right, amongst the bishops. And so religious orders did, and religious communities of monastics did look to the papacy for the approval of their rule, right, for the validation of, yes, the way that you say religious life should be done, yes, it conforms with what the church thinks, right? Another level of connection would be, of course, the providing of monies and the providing of properties that monastics did for the papacy. And then another level would be the way that the papacy was so pleased with monastic communities that it looked to monastic communities for to recruit members of the hierarchy. It said, "Oh, you guys are living your life so effectively, so spiritually. I see qualities of leadership in that abbot. I'm going to take that abbot and make him the bishop of this diocese." So that relationship did exist, but again, it was not nearly as direct and intimate as we imagine it might be. I think mainly because we have a different vision of what the papacy was. Yeah, please.
I really appreciate your presentation it's very hopeful and very kind of exciting as we get to this point. I guess my question for you is, just as a religious priest, what are you most excited about, or what are you maybe anticipating right now in our time and place?
I think that I don't want to say, again, I'm an historian, and all you do is, when you study history, the first myth that gets busted is that the era that you live in is any different than any previous era. You know, the first myth that gets busted is, we've got it so much better than anybody's ever had it before. Think of the technology we have. You know, we've got it so much worse. God, we're going to hell in a handbasket. You know, I think both of those myths get busted right away. So don't hear what I'm about to say as either of those two things, right? But I do think that every society, as it evolves and changes at different times and different moments, hits these crisis moments, and maybe hits, for lack of a better phrase, a breaking point. This may sound pessimistic, I don't mean it to be. I think that in a certain sense we're at that, or coming close to it now. What I mean by that is, I think we've lived now several generations of maybe an excessive individualism in the Western world. I think we've lived several generations. I mean, we could fairly say that maybe my generation was the first to live in the era of a high rate of divorce and of broken families. And I'm not judging with when I say that. I'm simply saying that that changes people and forms people in certain ways. That I think that young people today are perhaps more open to what religious life has to offer as a mode of difference and as a mode of gospel values that speaks something different than what the culture offers, right? I think that's the breaking point I'm getting at. So that the individualism and the broken home is spoken to by fidelity, lifelong fidelity, and the ability to make that commitment and live it out. It is possible, and we want to profess that belief. The belief that, yes, we're powerful as individuals and we are unique as God's beloved children, but we are communal beings, and that we need to be together in mission, and we need to be together in support. Human sexuality would be a whole other thing. But I think that, quickly to touch upon it, I think that's at a breaking point, right? It's at a point where, for all the benefits of the sexual revolution, and there are real benefits, even as the church we need to profess that, there were also major downsides, and the kind of objectification and of sexuality and of men and of women and of children and of the human body. I think that's at a breaking point. I think religious life has something to offer and to speak to that. So that's why I'm hopeful. That's why I say that I think there are, I look at the young men that join us right now. I've had the privilege to work with novices and with men at Old College. I was at Catholic University of America, and I got to see several different religious communities who sent their young people there for studies. And as I saw these people, I thought, these are all young people who, eyes wide open, they know what the society offers, they know what it teaches, they're successful young people, they're achievers, they don't go into this running from the world, they don't go this rejecting it, but they go having found something better. And they go finding a rock of solitude that they cling to joyfully amidst everything else that seems to say nothing is secure, nothing is permanent, nothing is enduring. You know, sorry I've gone on for longer than I should have, but I think that's the hopeful piece. That's where religious life is now. That's why we need to go back to ideals. That's why we need to be living authentically, because when we offer these things, I think it's powerfully compelling in every era, but perhaps particularly powerful and compelling now.
One thing I've noticed the thread through this whole piece here is as people have become more away, churches become more strict in their sayings, the growth because of the strictness is more than the people that are living the way they want to.
Yeah, and there's been a lot, that I could go on forever on this one too. There's been some pretty significant sociological theorizing and studying that notices that in the United States today, and this is not just amongst Catholics, right? In the United States today, the religious groups, religious orders or religious denominations that are succeeding the most are those who ask the most of their members. One of the theories about the decline of religious life in the United States is that precisely at the moment when things were up for grabs, things were being rethought and reformed, some of that demand, right, that high intensity was diminished. There were less expectations. One of the theories is that that didn't help, and that maintaining a certain amount of requirement and obligation and demand is actually really important for human life in general. That young people are called to that because it is a challenge. You want to step up. You want to be a part of something bigger than yourself. You want to commit, you know. So that, for example, mainline Protestantism is dead. The greatest story of American religious history in the last 20 years is the death of all of the mainline Protestant communities that for the previous 200 years of American life were the pinnacle of society. Produced all of our presidents, produced all of our CEOs, et cetera, et cetera. They're dead. The growth in American Protestantism is in evangelicalism. There's obviously very different shades of that. To say the word evangelicalism is to speak to 1,000 different realities at once. But one of the commonalities would be a certain amount of an expectation. If you're going to convert to Christ, if you're going to belong to Him, then this is how you're going to live your life, and this is how you're going to belong to the church, and this is how you're going to participate, this is how you're going to give, not only financially, but of your time. There's no halfway here, right? I think there is something to be said for that. And I think by its very nature, religious life has to be that way. If you're going to have as the heart of it, Christ who is poor, chaste, and obedient. Because to commit to those three things is a commitment. It is a demand. It's not easy. It's not meant to be. I don't think we can feign that. I don't think we can dance around it or skirt it. I think we need to face it head on, and I think we need to claim it and make it our own. And be okay to say, yeah, we're going to ask something of you. No, it's not going to be easy. That's okay. You know? I mean, I think of when I was growing up in the commercials for the Marine Corps, right? I mean, that's the whole appeal, isn't it? You're elite. You know? There's commitment. There's success in being well trained and well honed. I think that's as true in human life. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate your listening so attentively.